Welcome to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is philosophy professor Robert Martin. He's also the author of several books, including The Philosopher's Dictionary, actually one of my favorites. So if you stay with the show today, you're going to learn all kinds of I'll say weird and interesting details that you can impress your friends about. Dr. Martin, good to have you here.
Thanks, nice to be here.
Now, because your profession is philosophy, I figure that I can ask you all these difficult questions and you're going to give me intelligent, informed answers. Let's dip into the dictionary first, and it's full of all these wonderful terms. Can you tell me what consequentialism is to start?
Consequentialism is a kind of ethics, kind of way of doing ethics. And what it means is that you consider the consequences, the results of an action. Now that sounds pretty obvious, like what else would you consider? But lots of ethical thinkers think that no matter how good the results of an action are, if the action itself is bad, then you shouldn't do it. For instance, consequentialists will say if you tell a lie and it's got all kinds of good results, then it's a good thing to do. But anti-consequentialists say, no, you shouldn't tell a lie no matter what the consequences. That's the big division.
Are you a consequentialist?
Well, I am, but philosophers are really divided about it, and I think regular people are confused about that issue too. It's a really good question in ethics.
Yeah, it's a big one. As I go through the brief biographies there, I discover some of my favorites that I've encountered before. Diogenes advocated self-contained, unconventional lives for all of us. Tell me just a little bit about Diogenes.
The ancient philosophers in general are very interesting because almost nothing is known about almost any of them. We have a few little scraps here and there, and that's true for Diogenes and a lot of others. So there's not really very much to be known about. Well, one of the main themes of ancient philosophy, the ancient philosophers, Diogenes included, were interested in what a good life is. What's the right kind of life to lead?
Hey, I'm still worrying about that one today myself.
Well, philosophers, interestingly enough, nowadays are not much concerned with that anymore. Diogenes was, and he had some ideas about it. A lot of the Diogenes, along with a lot of philosophers in those days, thought that it's a very individual matter. How you arrange your own life and how it feels from the inside is what really counts. And so if you can get your life having some sort of coherent wholeness as far as you're concerned, then that's good enough. Now that's not an idea that's shared by everybody. Again, there's controversy about this. Other philosophers would say it's not what it feels like from the inside, but it's how you're relating to things on the outside that makes a difference.
But he would be for individualism and
yes.
sort of self-satisfaction. To a degree, finding
That's
meaning. Another of the older sort there, Boethius, was he the guy with the wheel? The picture of people at the top of the wheel and the bottom of the wheel? Punishment or something like that? What was his consolation of philosophy all about?
That's a good question. I can't remember offhand.
Oh, Boethius.
One of the obscure medieval philosophers.
Right, okay. Philosophy is full of a number of these canonized issues, these problems. Maybe you can tell me about one or two of them, like the gambler's fallacy or the free rider problem.
Gambler's fallacy is a mistake about thinking about probabilities. And philosophers are very interested in it because when everybody's making a mistake in reasoning all over the place, then there's something very funny going along. Well, the gambler's fallacy goes like this. Suppose that you're flipping a coin, and it's a fair coin, and it's come up heads 4 times in a row. Now, the gambler's fallacy is to think that the law of averages means that it's going to come up tails much more often now to even things out. Now, the reason it's called the gambler's fallacy is lots of people, when they're actually gambling, think that, for instance, on the roulette wheel, if the thing has come up on the red for a number of times, that means it's much more likely to come up on the black.
Seems
but
like
of course,
it should.
But yes, but it isn't.
No.
If you flip that, if that coin is really a fair coin, then it's got half probability of heads and half probability of tails. It doesn't matter how often it's come up heads in the past, it's still the next time it's half and half.
Right.
So you can make money off your friends by betting them and relying on them making this mistake in reasoning called the gambler's fallacy.
Yes, over and over. Suppose I woke up one morning and I was suffering from existential anguish. I saw that term in your book and I thought, hits the nail on the head. What would that be all about?
The word existential here means pertaining to existence. And it's associated with a group of philosophers called the Existentialists, largely French 20th century philosophers. The idea the existentialists had is that the very condition that human beings find themselves in is an uncomfortable one. It's not just that you wake up feeling a little uncomfortable one day, but you're recognizing something really essential about what it is to be human when you're feeling this discomfort. And feeling uncomfortable because the world doesn't tell you what kind of person you should be or what you should be doing now. You have no,
There's no certainty.
You don't have a place in the world like animals and other things do. They just act the way they have to because that's the kind of nature they have. My car won't start because the batteries run down. Put a dish of dog food down, the dog runs right over and starts eating. Animals and things behave the way they do because they have to, because that's their nature. Whereas human beings, the existentialists supposed, don't have any nature, so there's no particular way that we have to behave, nothing that we should become, nothing we should do. And so they thought that this kind of feeling of rootlessness, of not knowing what to do next, of having to make yourself up, produces anguish, produces dread, and a horrible feeling of, uh-oh, I've got to invent myself again today, that you feel when you get up in the morning. And if you feel that way, then you're feeling existential anguish.
Does that in any way assert that you are very much alive if you feel that anguish?
Yeah. It's something to be proud of for the existentialists because it puts us above, makes us different from the rest of the things in the world. And it makes us sort of special and extra good in a way that we can create ourselves, whereas everything else is just being what it's got to be. But it's also a big pain in the neck, and it's awful. I mean, just think of the responsibility. Here's the rest of your life stretching out ahead of you, and you have to invent it some sort of way or other with no guidance from and no push from the way the world, the outside world is. And so it's a big responsibility and no help.
Suppose those worrisome existentialists are wrong, however, and we're actually just, borrowing from your book here this term, we're a brain in a vat. Tell me about that situation.
Brain in the vat is a funny example that philosophers have come up with to ask a philosophical question that's hard to answer. Philosophical question is this. Just imagine that you're nothing but a brain sitting there, that you have no body, no rest of your body, no sense organs. The only thing that's you is a brain, and it's sitting in a vat full of a nutritive liquid to keep you alive. And there are wires coming in and out of it attached to a computer. And some mad scientist is working the computer and feeding you sense inputs. So you think you taste your breakfast when you wake up, and you think you can see your room, and you think you see your friends, and you feel like you're moving, and you
it's all
feel
a hallucination,
though. So everything in your life is a hallucination. Now, that's something we can imagine. Everybody knows it's false. No philosopher is crazy enough to think that that's true. Why it's of philosophical interest is that philosophers say, how can you prove, ask the question, can you prove that it's false? In fact, do you have any reason at all to think that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false? And some philosophers have concluded, surprisingly, you have no reason at all to think that it's false. It's just a prejudice on your part. Other philosophers have tried to come up with a reason to think that it's false. But this is one of the open questions that philosophers
So
like
it's
to puzzle
still
themselves
a
with.
reasonable possibility that we are indeed the brain in the vat.
Here's one possible reply that a philosopher has come up with recently. Thinking about anything requires contact with it. I mean, the only time I can be said to be thinking about a table is if I'm actually in contact with the real table. Now, this brain in the vat isn't in contact with anything, so it can't think about anything. And so it couldn't even wonder if it's a brain in the vat.
It wouldn't have those reference points.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
That's right, because thinking is contact with things
Yes.
outside of you. And so the brain couldn't even think, so it couldn't even have false thoughts.
Yes.
It couldn't have true thoughts. It couldn't have thoughts. Now, if you're convinced you've got thoughts, then you're convinced you're not a brain in the vat.
Well, that's very comforting indeed. In your recent book that's titled, The Unlikely Title, there are two errors in the title of this book, although I know I didn't exactly get that title right. The reader will have to figure that out for himself. What's the nature of that book? You're popularizing philosophy, deep and complex things. What were you trying to do?
It's a collection of philosophical anecdotes, science fiction stories, puzzles, paradoxes, imaginative exercises, like the brain in the vat. And every one of these is interesting, I hope, and is amusing and is compelling, and every one of these leads to a philosophical question.
Like, toward the beginning there, you say, if everything in the universe doubled in size, the question would be, would I be aware of this?
Mm-hmm.
What's the answer?
A lot of philosophers think the answer is no, you wouldn't be aware of it. Or suppose that everything suddenly moved 2 feet to the left. Or suppose that everything stopped for 15 seconds, just completely froze. You froze. The world around you froze. The clock on the clock on the wall froze. Everything froze for 15 seconds and then started up again. Of course, you wouldn't notice it. Just as you wouldn't notice if everything, including you and your eyes and everything doubled in size or moved, 10 feet to the left or something. Now, so what? Well, one philosophically, so what? Which is the question you have to ask about all these silly imaginations. One so what that some philosophers have taken from them is that if it doesn't make any conceivable difference, if there's no conceivable way of noticing the difference that that thing would make, if it's a difference that makes no difference, then it's not a difference at all. Now, that's a controversial attitude toward those things, toward those questions, and it diagnoses the problem here as we're imagining that we think we're imagining something, but in fact we're not imagining anything, because this is a difference that wouldn't make any difference.
Philosophers down through the ages have worried about this question of whether we live in the best of all possible worlds or not. Who was it that focused on that?
The slogan about the best of all possible worlds is associated with Leibniz, German rationalist philosopher.
He said we did, yes?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And in the philosophical tradition, there are a number of philosophers who argue that in some sense or other we do, although it didn't seem to me to be that way at 6:30 this morning when I woke up.
Why would Leibniz say it? In fact, you weren't too happy at that moment, it still was the best of all possible worlds.
Well, one motive is a religious motive. They think that God created the world that we live in. God's got our interests at heart. God wants to make the world the best for us because God likes us. And God has complete power to make the world any way God wants to make the world. So the world must have been created the best possible place for us to live in. Now, the problem immediately arises that from our perspective, it very often doesn't look like that sort of thing. So a number of philosophers have spent a good deal of mental effort trying to prove that it really is, despite appearances, the best kind of possible world for us to live in.
Okay, and I'd like to think that it was. And we're going to take a short break and be back right after this. And welcome back to the show. My guest today is Robert Martin. We're talking about many things philosophical. God and philosophy come together many times, and sometimes religious ideas and intellectual ideas are at odds. In your book there, you speak about one of these problems, a kind of paradox perhaps. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, can he create a rock that's too heavy for him to lift?
The puzzle, of course, is if you say God can create a rock too heavy for him to lift, then he wouldn't be able to lift the rock, so he wouldn't be all-powerful. On the other hand, if he can't create a rock too heavy for him to lift, then there's something he can't do, so
Yes.
he wouldn't be all-powerful. And the idea that seems that some philosophers conclude from this little puzzle is that the whole idea of omnipotence, really being able to do everything, doesn't make any sense. Now, some religious thinkers have taken this to heart and tried to rethink the idea of God as not somebody, not like a person except unlimited in power, if the notion of unlimited power doesn't make any sense at all. A number of religious thinkers have thought that there are must be other limits to what God can do. Like, for instance, God can't make a logical contradiction true. God can't make it, it's raining today, but God couldn't make it be both raining and not raining at the same time in the same place, no matter how hard he tried.
Is that maybe just the limitations of our language and the ability of our language to formulate some of these complex ideas?
Well, it's the kind of state of affairs that we're thinking about when it's raining and it's not raining, both at the same place in the same, or when it's Tuesday but it's not Tuesday, or in the same place, same time, so on. Yes. These are impossibilities because they're logical impossibilities. Some philosophers have thought, well, logic is not a limitation on God. Logic, if you're trying to think logically, you're limiting your thought processes.
Certainly.
Try to think illogically.
Okay.
You know, why is logic the only way to do things? Open your mind and start imagining contradictions, and you might get closer to an idea of what reality is like in that case. Now, this is not a popular move among philosophers who mostly are feel themselves constrained by rationality and by logic. But it's got a certain kind of tradition in thinking about religious thought. Some philosophers have thought that religious thought, you know, restricting it to just the rational and the logical, is leaving a whole lot out about what makes religious thought so interesting and, according to them, so valuable.
And I would agree with that idea. Yeah, we do need to embrace a bit of the both. Pascal, however, philosopher, he thought that believing in God was a good bet.
A good bet, yeah, that's right.
Why?
Well, suppose you, if you believe in God, then, according to Pascal, if there really is a God, then that guarantees you, providing you act according to your beliefs, that guarantees you salvation. Whereas if there isn't a God and you're a believer, then you've just made a mistake. That's no big deal. So there's everything to gain and nothing to lose if you're a believer. On the other hand, suppose you're a non-believer. If you're an atheist, and if there is a God, then you get damned to hell. But if there isn't a God, you were right. Big deal. So there's everything to lose and not much to gain from atheism.
And,
so it's a good bet.
Yeah, there is one of the best arguments I've heard for religion.
Yeah, now the reply to this one is that, are you really a religious believer? I mean, is this really a profound way of approaching religious belief that really gets at what religion is about, when you're sort of calculating the odds here and seeing what's to your best advantage and saying, oh yeah, it's a good bet, I guess I'll believe. This doesn't seem to characterize really what religious people are about.
So it could be some hypocrisy there. Much ink has been spilled in your profession concerning the idea of happiness, and why is it so hard for us to be happy? What have philosophers said about that?
Some philosophers think that happiness, or putting it, not just, that happiness is the aim of life and is the standard by which we can measure ethically good or bad action. So what's a good action is what brings about human happiness. What's a bad action is what reduces it or produces human unhappiness. Yeah. Now, this is not, a lot of philosophers think this is a big mistake, that happiness has nothing to do with the ethically right or wrong. And that there are much more important things in life, like the more stern ethical thinkers think that happiness is not what we're after. I mean, if that's all we were after, then everyone could take a happy pill, then we'd all be jolly. But what's the good of that? Where's the ethical, why is that, that wouldn't make life worth living if we were all feeling jolly and happy.
What about those hedonists? There's something called the philosophical hedonists. You know, are they just saying sort of drink up, have lots of sex, and live for pleasure?
Some of them are, actually. But you find many more philosophers, and I'm not saying that they're right just because they win the vote, who are hedonists, and who say the definition of a hedonist is somebody who thinks that pleasure, human pleasure or happiness, is the only thing worth seeking. But a lot of them say it's not just a lot of eating and drinking and sex, but there are a lot of other important things too. Although eating and drinking and sex are probably good things. But there are a lot of other important things too, which sometimes outweigh those things. And they'll add to it the pleasures of companionship and the pleasures of, you know, your relationship with your family and your obligations, you're fulfilling your obligations to your friends and to your community and so on. And so it turns out that hedonism in its ordinary use just means, hey, let's get out there and have, you know, break out the booze and have a ball. But philosophical hedonists very often have got a little richer idea of what pleasure and happiness amounts to than that.
Well, that sounds pretty good, and I think we all should dip back into those philosophical hedonists and find out what they have to say. I'm going to take a very short break here, and we'll be back with Dr. Robert. Off the page, my guest today is Dr. Martin. One final quick question. Do we live in a finite or an infinite universe? And you only have about 10 seconds.
10 seconds. The answer is yes. It's either finite or infinite.
It's one or the other.
That's right.
And we could debate that endlessly. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank
you.
you.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.